Yeah, so thanks so much for the honor of being here this year to give this Mauno Koivisto lecture. I chose to present this work, I mean, obviously together with the organizers, but this work, as was so nicely introduced just now, is on sexual harassment and gender inequality in the labor market. Our motivation for this work is partly the topic of gender segregation and pay inequality that exists between workplaces in the labor market. Here we can think of a person with similar education, like a lawyer. After they graduate law degree, they might go to a private company, like a private law firm with a lot of men, presumably. They could go into the private, like the public sector, presumably with more women. As an academic, I could go into a more or less like female-dominated workplace, etc. So we're thinking about like people can work in different workplaces, conditional on kind of the occupation and education they have. And between workplaces, there's a lot of gender segregation. Women tend to work in workplaces with a lot of women and men with a lot of men. And this is strongly related, this pattern, to the pay level of the company. Pay seems to be much higher, usually in workplaces with a lot of men, and vice versa. Women-dominated workplaces pay less for a similar occupational composition. And this pattern is an important contributing factor to the overall pay inequality between women and men. And research has argued that, in economics at least, that work conditions and different preferences for work conditions between women and men is an important explanation. Women have, as we know, more responsibilities, usually in the household, so they might look for workplaces that offer more family-friendly work conditions. The idea in this literature is that because women prefer those work conditions, they go to firms that offer them, and in exchange for these family-friendly work conditions, they accept the lower wage in those firms, and men are going to be in the high-paying firms with less flexible work conditions. Okay, we don't like take issue with that explanation. Instead, we offer another explanation that is founded more in what we think of as discrimination in work conditions. And we're going to argue that sexual harassment against workplace gender minorities helps to reinforce this type of labor market inequality between workplaces that segregates women into workplaces with more women and lower pay, and men into workplaces with more men and higher pay. So the paper, in a nutshell, consists of this main argument that sexual harassment shapes this dual pattern of workplace sex segregation and pay inequality between these workplaces. That's kind of our first argument. And then we also have two arguments about mechanisms about how this happens. We're saying that sexual harassment maintains this pattern of segregation and pay inequality first by preventing new people from wanting to become a gender minority in the workplace, and second, by kind of forcing people who have already chosen to be such a workplace gender minority to switch out of that status. So it's like preventing people from desegregating workplaces, and the people who have already desegregated them, kind of pushing them to for women, for example, going to a more women-dominated workplace. I'm going to present three sets of empirical results that I think support these arguments. First, we're going to show descriptively that workplace gender minorities have higher harassment rates. And this means, because workplaces with more men have higher wages and vice versa, that women are going to be harassed in high-paying workplaces in the labor market, and men are going to be harassed mainly in low-paying workplaces in the labor market. Second, I'm going to show, this time with the survey experiment, that harassment deters people from wanting to become the gender minority in the workplace. Both women and men are prevented by information about this bad work conditions from wanting to take jobs in where their gender is the minority. And then third, I'm going to show using panel data for job switches that for people who are such a gender minority, when they face harassment, they make job changes that kind of contribute to expanding inequalities. There are many ways, like theoretically, that we can look at this issue. And on this slide, I'm summarizing the theoretical arguments that we make in the paper. There can be various reasons why workplace gender minorities have higher harassment risks compared to the gender majority in the same workplace. One is that if you are a gender minority in a workplace, you're more likely to violate gender norms in your choice of workplace, maybe your choice of occupation and tasks within that workplace and so on. And violating gender norms can cause retaliatory behavior, maybe relating to the closure concept from Weber that we heard about, like where the majority group are going to retaliate against the minority when it like breaks the expected behaviors of the minority group. So yeah, sexual harassment, we know it's not mostly a misunderstood romance. It's mostly a way to put down people, and often in a workplace minority. So that might be one reason. Another reason might be purely mechanical, because sexual harassment often happens between people of opposite genders. And when you are in a workplace with more people of the opposite gender, and assuming that each person has a low but latent, constant probability to harass, then as a woman, the more men I interact with in the workday, mechanically, there's going to be a larger probability that one of them harasses me, and vice versa for men in women-dominated firms. So we're thinking that like gender minorities, both men and women, are more likely to be harassed than gender majorities in the same workplace. And in addition, we're thinking that this harassment pattern with one high-risk gender and one low-risk gender imposes like a larger disutility. It's considered a larger problem for the exposed group in the workplace compared to the non-exposed group. So women in a women-dominated firm or workplace where men are the main harassment target, women there aren't going to consider it as much of a problem as the men do. Yeah, there's not like perfect empathy here between the genders in that way. So what that means is that the disutility from this like skewed form of work environment discrimination is not only going to impose a higher risk on one group, it's also going to be considered a larger problem for that minority. And this is why I think we can think of sexual harassment as a tax paid by gender minorities in workplaces. So yes, if sexual harassment works as a tax on gender minorities in workplaces, it's obvious, I guess, that it's going to reduce the likelihood that people want to become such a minority. And once they do become such a minority, it's going to increase the chances that they want to stop. And they're going to go like leave the firm and go to a place where their harassment risk is lower. Yes. And then finally, if we have this tax on the gender minority, it kind of deters entry and causes systematic turnover, then this might uphold this pattern that I spoke about just now, about that consists of this dual pattern of gender segregation and pay inequality between workplaces. So data here for the first part is going to come from Swedish government surveys done every second year and targeting a representative sample of the Swedish labor force. We use 6 cross sections, and we link each respondent to panel data for the full Swedish population, meaning that we can get this precise continuous measure of workplace sex compositions. There exists some previous research, usually in small samples, that has looked at sexual harassment risks by self-reported categories of the gender composition of firms.
But this is, I think, the first time that we're looking at, like, we can look in very detailed ways at the exact sex composition of the workplace, because for each person, we can find all their colleagues in the Swedish administrative data. For each survey respondent, we know exactly who works in their same workplace. We have 2 survey questions on sexual harassment. Each one asks about harassment in the last 12 months. And very importantly, they ask about harassment from people employed in the workplace of the victim, colleagues or managers. These 2 questions together capture 3 out of the 4 common types of sexual harassment that research has categorized. Unwanted sexual attention can be physical or non-physical forms of unwanted sex-related behavior at work. It can be physical touching that's unwanted, or it can be crude conversation or showing crude pictures, things like that. Sexual, well, first, yes. Then sexual hostility is like disrespectful and hostile behavior that's based on gender, but not necessarily sex related. So this can be comments, for example, that women or men aren't really appropriate for a certain occupation, and really like degrading comments on men or women in the workplace. So gender harassment isn't always it's not always included in the legal definition of sexual harassment. Here we pool these things together. It doesn't matter for the results. Like, the results actually look very, very similar for both types. In the beginning of the project, we thought maybe that wouldn't be the case, but it turned out that it's very, very similar. So in the end, the analysis pools the 2. So we set this binary indicator. Oh yeah, we don't have information here on sexual coercion. This is the type of harassment that happens as a quid pro quo, where usually physical unwanted sex-related behaviors are related to some threat of punishment or promise of reward. Like, you won't get promoted unless blah, 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 or I will give you blah if you blah, blah, blah. And this is by far like the least common form of sexual harassment in surveys, yet in the public domain with the Me Too movement, it had a very large role in like the portrayal of the accusations in the Me Too movement. So we unfortunately cannot capture that. And what we do is we create this binary indicator for self-reporting any of these forms of harassment in the last 12 months. And as always, there's going to be weaknesses in how we design these measures. One of our questions does mention sexual harassment. And even if both include various examples of the behaviors, we don't have a behavioral, like a 20 list item question, like this complete kind of behavioral list. Nevertheless, we produce this graph, which is our first main result. So here we have the 50,000 women and men who respond to the Swedish Work Environment Survey, and we split them by sex at birth. Here on the x-axis, we have the share of men in the respondents' workplaces, and each one of these markers is the average of about 300 respondents. So when we look at the share who self-report sexual harassment in the last 12 months, we can immediately see here that for women, like women self-report much more sexual harassment than men, about 3 times as much in this Swedish data. And for women, there's almost a linear relationship where you start in the most women-dominated firms, so like very low share of men, at around like little less, like maybe like 2% harassment in the last 12 months, going all the way up to 25% in the last 12 months in the most male-dominated workplaces in the Swedish labor market. And for men, we see, in the most male-dominated workplaces, it's obvious that women are harassed much, much, much more than their male counterparts. Men are self-report much less harassment, more or less everywhere, like the male-dominated firms, the mixed firms, but there's a jump upward in the distribution for men in the most women-dominated workplaces. And in the most women-dominated workplaces, like when the share is like 90%, we see men definitely being harassed more than women in those workplaces. And the share among men is high as well, like in an absolute sense. So both women and men here seem to be harassed more than the opposite gender when they are the minority in a very skewed like workplace. The right-hand side tries to look at least cursively on some explanations for why this might be the case. And I already mentioned gender norms associated with occupation choice, and I mentioned this mechanical effect, the contact hypothesis. So what we do here is that we run regressions of like for men and women in separate subsamples, and we regress the dummy variable for sexual harassment on this variable here, and we report essentially the slope of this relationship for women, so positive slopes, and the slope for this relationship for men, so like a negative slope. And then we just insert some control variables to see if some specific controls reduce the size of the correlation. When we include first, like occupation fixed effects, it does do some for men, like the relationship declines. So maybe for men, there's some, arguably, you know, this is a highly imperfect way of looking at explanations, but yet it's interesting to see like that occupation explains definitely more for men than for women here. We look at whether or not you have like the gender of your supervisor, because people are often harassed by their supervisor. And of course, if you're in a workplace dominated by the opposite sex, that supervisor might harass you. So that also actually is, yeah, it's important. Like if I would plot this graph and I would plot women separately for like women with a male supervisor and women with a female supervisor, essentially like the distribution just splits up into two lines. Like throughout like the whole distribution here, there's a higher average for women with a male supervisor compared to women with a woman supervisor. And for men, it looks, it looks similar. We don't really have the same like support. There's not enough women supervisors out here, but for sure here, like in the cases where men have a male supervisor that we can compare to, there seems to be something similar. So that could be another like mechanism of interest. Some like a reason for adding demographics here is not necessarily as an explanation, but more to discuss measurement error coming from labeling or recall. We might think that women in the male-dominated firms are maybe have higher education or something that makes them more aware of sexual harassment. So what we're capturing here is like, it's how you answer the survey question rather than the actual harassment. But controlling for demographics, sex at birth, the global region of birth, education level, and the age doesn't really change the estimates. And we can reproduce this graph only for women who went to college or university, for example, and it looks the same. Yes, so it's not like, I don't think there's a lot of evidence here that this is coming from like highly educated women's perceptions of harassment. Yeah, we also control for productivity and firm size. Sometimes we're a critique that we face with this work was that women in these firms are like, they are unproductive and bad at their jobs, so they're blaming it on sexual harassment, which I don't find like a credible explanation. Nevertheless, we did some various work to look at it, and it did not have any importance according to those tests. So all in all then, women self-report more harassment than men. Both men and women report higher and more harassment when they are the gender minority in the workplace. What about wages? I mean, I already told you in the beginning, there's lots and lots of evidence that sex segregation between workplaces explains a large proportion of the wage gap, and these papers exist by now for many countries, also for Sweden. So male-dominated workplaces tend to have higher wages, conditional on the occupation structure, than women-dominated workplaces. That's also true in Sweden. So that when we calculate these workplace wage premia, which is essentially comparing now using all workplaces in the whole Swedish labor market and benchmarking each workplace wage level to other workplaces with similar occupation structures, like industry occupation, who works in these workplaces, you can extract differences in terms of percent from the average similar type of workplace. So 0.6 here would mean that a workplace pays 6% more than the comparable workplace. And negative 0.6 would mean that it pays 6% less than kind of like the average of their type of workplace in the labor market. Here we have the same as before. I showed you the graph for men and women, and now I'm just plotting the difference between those two lines. Women's harassment rate minus men's. So this has negative values where men are harassed more than women, and positive values where women are harassed more than men. And you can see, like, for increments of 5 percentage points, we plot averages of this harassment gap. Goes from negative, of course, to positive. Women are harassed more than men in the male-dominated firms up here, workplace up here. And then we can also plot this average wage premium of these workplaces, again, by increments of 5 percentage points of the distribution of the share men. And you can see how, like, clearly, like, more male-dominated workplaces pay more. Men are harassed more than women in these lowest paid workplaces in the Swedish labor market, and women are harassed definitely more than men in the highest paying workplaces. Yeah. So now, this is like the basis, right, of our paper, is this pattern of the gender skew in the risk and the simultaneous pattern of pay differences between workplaces. Now, I said we have two explanations or two mechanisms whereby this dual pattern of segregation and harassment risks contribute to maintaining the inequality. One is that people are systematically deterred from becoming the gender minority in a workplace. And we try to look at that, like we investigate that research question with a survey experiment. This type of survey experiment is called a conjoint hypothetical job choice experiment, because you ask respondents to make hypothetical job choices. So if you were the respondent of the survey, you would read our question saying something like, imagine that you're looking for a job and you have been given 2 job offers. This table below shows you the set of 2 job offers that you have been given. And please consider these jobs to be equivalent, like identical in all other dimensions than those mentioned in the table. Please indicate below each column, there's going to be a little checkbox, and you indicate which job you would be most likely to accept out of these offers. So we sent this survey experiment to about 4,000 employed Swedish respondents, or that's how many responses we got in the end. There's about 70% response rate. Respondents each made 3 choices. We included 4 traits of these hypothetical jobs: the wage level, the skill, degree of skill development that you can get on the job, flexibility to schedule your own hours, and the working environment. I mean, people have employed these types of experiments before, and it's looked like these are standard things to include. What we added was the working environment here. So each time a person gets this table in the survey, there's a randomization of the rows, like these appear in different order. But more importantly, there's also randomization with respect to the values of these traits. And that randomization happens based on a schedule that the researcher sets on beforehand. So for example, for the wage level, we had 5 values. Like the job offer gives you 10% less than you earn currently. It gives you 5% less. It gives you the same wage as now, gives you 5% more, it gives you 10% more. So here you want to put in realistic values. So we kind of took all the wage changes from the Swedish administrative data. When people change jobs, what kind of wage changes do they usually get? You take the distribution, you try to kind of put in these values where it's most realistic. And remember, I think I had on the previous slide, but these are only employed respondents in this survey. We don't have any unemployed or like students or anything like that. Okay, those value very randomly, and we also varied the work environment trait. What happens when you do this? Okay, the point with this experiment is to measure how much people value different work conditions. Because by randomly assigning the traits of job A and job B, we can look at how the choice of job A versus job B changes. So when we change the wage here, we can observe like how much does the probability to pick a certain job change when we change the wage trait. Yeah, you run essentially a regression where the outcome is like 1 for choosing job A, otherwise 0. 1 for choosing job B, otherwise 0. So like each column is one observation in the data. And on the right-hand side, we have dummy variables for each value of each trait. So that gives us estimates of like 5% more wage. How much does that increase the probability of picking that job? 10% higher wage. How much does that increase the probability of picking a job? Then for the work, essentially for the other traits, we can also look at how job choices change when we randomize the value of the work condition. And we can benchmark how those choices change relative to how the wage trait impacts choices. So if a certain trait changes, for example, maybe my chance of choosing a job like by 20%, like I become 20% less likely to choose one of these jobs. We can take the estimates and say, okay, what wage change shifts the probability to choose a job by the same margin? Okay. So maybe that's like a 10% lower wage also shifts the probability by like negative 20%. That means that I evaluate this specific work condition as much as a 20% lower wage. Yes, that's called like the willingness to pay. It's essentially a way of measuring the utility from different work conditions, like people's valuations of different work conditions with this method. So we are, of course, interested in measuring if people's likelihood to pick one of these jobs changes if we inform people about sexual harassment that happened in these fictional workplaces. So we do that in this work environment trait. You don't want to say in here, like there was sexual harassment, because then the respondent can themselves imagine what that sexual harassment is. Like you want to shut down opportunities to have noise in the data depending on different people thinking about this concept in different ways. So instead, we do something like this. The work environment trait has 6, I think, levels. We say that you have no information about the work environment. We say that you have information that the work environment is good. We say that you knew that there was conflict between the manager and employees. And then we also give them randomly three little vignettes about a specific sexual harassment or gender harassment incident that happened. And we use some survey data we collected with the sexual experiences questionnaire, a much longer set of items. We go by categories of sexual harassment, and we picked these as the most common forms as given by that other survey data that we collected. So we want to represent kind of the most common types of harassment incidents. So here, sexist hostility, women in the work unit have expressed that men aren't suitable for the job. Sexual hostility, a woman in the work unit makes male co-workers uncomfortable by stubbornly discussing her sex life and then groping for unwanted sexual attention. So the main design choice that we did here was to show people a gender of the victim and the gender of the perpetrator that corresponded to the first pattern we found in the paper of the skewed risk pattern. So we asked each respondent, since these are all employed respondents currently, we asked them about the sex composition of their current workplace. So for people who currently were working like in a kindergarten with mostly women, we showed them women perpetrators and male victims. And for respondents who worked in a mixed like they were a teacher in a high school, or a male-dominated, like they were a police officer, we showed them women victims and male perpetrators. So this lets us, of course, estimate the total, like disutility from harassment from everyone, but we can also break up the estimation into people who saw a same-sex victim, like these gender minorities, and women in mixed firms saw, and men in women-dominated firms saw same-sex victim, and others saw, like the gender majorities in workplaces saw opposite-sex victims. So here are the estimates. The willingness to pay, as I said, estimating how the likelihood to pick a specific job changes by the work conditions and rescaling that estimate by reactions to the wage. So 0.01 here means that, it means that a work condition is negatively evaluated at the same kind of amount as a 10% lower wage compared to your current job. So for sexual harassment as a whole, I think we had 11%, like sexual harassment for anyone was valued at about 11% lower wage. But the most important result here is the huge, the sizable difference that we find between men and women who see a victim of the opposite sex as themselves in the vignette, to men and women who see a victim of the same sex as themselves in the vignette. And the negative perception of sexual harassment was about 3 times as large if you saw information about a victim of the same sex as yourself, and much smaller, like not 0, but definitely not large if you saw a person of the opposite sex. So we think that's very important, because obviously that's going to mean that not only is the gender minority more harassed, but they perceive that harassment as a much worse work problem compared to the gender majority, which is not harassed. Yeah. So this is why, this is the basis kind of for our conclusion that there's going to be a deterrence effect, because people, as we also ask in our survey, people have information about harassment when they're looking for jobs. Like we ask these respondents, what kind of information do you have about this type of incident that we had in the table in firms in your industry? And more than 2/3 said that they had information about cases like this. So this seems to be information that people have. And according to the risk pattern, this would systematically deter the high-risk gender from wanting to take this status of being a gender minority, we argue. Yeah, over here you can see, of course, split by gender. That wasn't really pre-registered, but I still think it's interesting to see that women aren't really nice here. Women are pretty fine with working in workplaces where men are being harassed. Yeah. So the second mechanism is about turnover. Suppose that someone is already a gender minority, maybe they switch after they face harassment as a gender minority. So now we return to the national representative survey data linked with the employer-employee data that I talked about before. So this is my second to last graph, and slide. And I'm showing you here our analysis of turnover. What we do is we use the fact that for each survey respondent, we can observe where they worked each year before and after they responded to the survey. So year 0 is the year when they responded. Year 1 is 1 year after, 2 years after, 3, 4, blah. And we estimate the difference here in the binary indicator for having left the firm where you responded to the survey. So having made a transition. And we regress that dummy variable on a dummy variable for experiencing harassment here. Yeah. So here you report if you were sexually harassed or not, and we're comparing the harassed to the non-harassed in the probability to have left that workplace. So positive estimates here of about between 3 and 5 percentage points means that harassed people are between 3 and 5 percentage points more likely to have left the firm where they took the survey. And this is against the baseline of about a 20 percentage point likelihood to switch workplaces within any in any 3 to 5 year interval. So women are more likely to change, and men are also more likely to change. And this is like, we have different specifications here because, for example, young people, they change firms more often. They are also more likely to face harassment. So we're not like purely capturing an age effect here. This is, there's a reduction in the estimates, but we can add like very small flexible controls for age. We can also control for the share of men in the workplace. So it's not that necessarily like women and men, women, for example, just want to avoid the male-dominated workplaces for various reasons. Yeah, we can hold constant the share of men in the workplace and look only at the harassment. So women and men both seem to leave workplaces more often when they self-report harassment there. Oh, okay. And the second kind of part of this analysis is that for these people who leave, we look at their next workplace because we know that they left. We see where they go, right? Because in each year we know where they work. So we can compare the workplace they left and the workplace they went to with respect to the share of men and this pay level variable. And for women, it's very clear that like women who leave workplaces after sexual harassment are much more likely than other women who switch jobs to go to lower paying workplaces with more women in them. So for women, it definitely seems to be the case that like harassment triggers these exits from high-paying, male-dominated workplaces where women are facing the most harassment and pushing those women toward more female-dominated firms with lower pay. And for men, we don't find any correlation with like where you go isn't systematically different from the place you left. And I think that's like for two reasons that might be logical. I mean, if you face a bad work condition and discrimination in the most low-paying firms in the labor market, it's not so easy to just like take a job in a high-paying firm. Yeah, but for women, you can kind of go down in the wage distribution. But for men, like they have these bad work conditions where they're already like the worst-paying places. Also, the sample size is small, but I think there's a strong, like at least indication in the data that like men in these women-dominated jobs, there's like an extra exposure of foreign-born men. And the Swedish government has tried to like make, we've had like refugee immigration, young men, etc. We have these occupations in the like female-dominated jobs in the public sector. There's been a shortage of workers. So maybe like these foreign-born men can work in elderly care facilities, for example, and so on. And there's some indication here that those men are facing very bad work conditions there. There's certainly like an even higher level of harassment against them, self-reported, but the sample is small. But I think it's like yet another reason that it might be difficult to switch into like a better workplace for those harassment. So summarizing, we argue in this paper that workplace gender minorities, both men and women, suffer higher rates of sexual harassment from colleagues and managers. And they have also a larger negative preference for this work condition than the gender majority colleagues that they have in the workplace. So this makes sexual harassment essentially a tax on these gender minorities. And that tax is being paid in the Swedish labor market, at least, by women in high-paying workplaces and men in low-paying workplaces. So we argue finally that this tax on the gender minority maintains sex segregation and the pay gap by deterring new people from wanting to become a gender minority and causing switches among people who already entered into that status. Thank you.